So theories of deviance is what we're going over next. And I really like this picture actually, because it basically extremely accurately demonstrates what deviance is. Because when we think about deviance, we often think with a negative connotation, like crooks or criminals, thieves. And often when we are talking about deviance, that is what we're talking about, but not completely 100%. So basically deviance is just separation from the normal, and that's nothing more, nothing less. And let's get into it. So deviance is non-normative behavior. Non-normative behavior, is considered incorrect by a society because it threatens the social structure and social cohesion. So basically that's what we've been talking about right now. We have these norms in place to keep that social structure in order. It benefits everybody. So when non-normative behavior is evident, we use these sanctions and we try to correct it. So actions that violate the dominant social norms are known as deviance. So the concept of deviance has a lot of social implications, and there have been a lot of studies. There have been a lot of, prominent sociologists that study deviance, especially relating to criminology. It has a really big influence on, how we view criminology. So the concept of deviance has a lot of social implications. Creating the deviant label affirms and enforces social norms by setting up a dichotomy between the two. So by creating a deviant label, we're basically separating deviant from normative behavior. So by creating a bad category, quote unquote, we are also creating a good category. So it's a dichotomy between the two different behaviors that we want to set up very clearly for each member of society. So that's why we have sanctions as well, to clearly outline what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not acceptable. So the deviant behavior can be punished and discouraged by both formal and informal means, like we spoke about before. Informal means, if you do something weird in public, you're going to get disapproving looks from bystanders. Formal means, if you break a law, you're going to get arrested, you're going to get fined, you may be even thrown in jail. So remember that deviance, like taboo, is a social construct, and that goes back to what I was just talking about over here. In Western culture, and usually in most most spheres, when we're talking about deviance, we're talking about criminology, but it's not always the case. So someone deviant in another society may not be considered deviant in this society because it's a social structure, it's a construct. It just means that they are deviating from the norm, and that specific society has deemed that deviant behavior is dangerous to social cohesion. But something that's deviant in one culture may not be deviant in another culture. Food, for example, eating certain foods in America may be considered deviant, but if you go to other parts of the world, it's just part of the norm. It's just normative behavior. Okay, so a little bit about differential association, and that is the theory that is proposed by Edwin Sutherland, pictured right here to the right, and it argues that deviance is a learned behavior resulting from an individual's interactions with their peers and environment. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the theories of deviance. So an individual will learn from their immediate social environment the techniques, motives, and values of deviant behavior. When an individual is part of a group, either formal or informal, so formal could be pretty much anything, a political party, anything that's on the books. Informal can be like a street gang, a group of friends. So when they're part of a group that condones deviant behavior, it's easier for the individual to learn this behavior. And that, again, happens in both formal and informal groups. So it's basically what Sutherland is saying. The basis of this theory is just the learned behavior resulting from an individual's interactions with their peers and environment. So it's basically saying that we're learning this deviant behavior from something. It's not coming internally. It's not coming out of necessity. It's coming out of learning. We're with a group of people that think it's okay, so we're going to think it's okay. And the bottom line, individuals become deviant when their contact with favorable views towards deviance outweigh their contacts with unfavorable views. So if we're thinking about maybe a middle school kid who's hanging out, who has had the same group of friends for the last 5 or 6 years, we're thinking about middle schoolers thinking about drug use, for example. That friend group is very against it. They don't want to do it. So if you're part of that friend group, you're also more likely to adopt those norms. You're also against drug use and you fit in with the group that way. But if you stumble upon a new friend group and, they're drinking, doing drugs, and you're part of that, you're going to want to fit in. According to differential association, that's pretty much all the factors that you need, to exhibit deviant behavior, just because you're part of that group. And the views that those people hold in terms of the deviant behavior is going to be a lot more favorable than the views that the previous group has held. So now, because you're in contact with those favorable views and you're no longer in contact with the unfavorable views, the chance for committing deviant behavior is going to be extremely, extremely high. So another theory when we talk about deviance that we can discuss is called labeling theory. And it was created by Howard Becker, and that is him to the left. So differential association has been criticized for its failure to account for an individual's characteristics and experiences and how they affect deviant influences. Differential association, like we just said, puts a lot of emphasis on the environment. So it's basically, we are pretty much just a product of our environment, and our behavior is completely learned from our peers and from our environment. One of the huge criticisms of differential association is that we're humans. We have internal monologue. There are factors internally that affect our decisions and that affect our behavior. So labeling theory accounts for that a little bit more. Like I said, created by Howard Becker. It argues that deviant behavior is the result of society's response to a person rather than that person's inherent self. So when we're talking about labeling, we're talking more so about how society as a whole has an effect, and how these social constructs and labels have effects on our own behavior. So labeling can have effects on the way society views deviance and the way deviants view themselves. And that's the most important part of labeling theory, I would say. So individuals labeled as deviants may be more likely to engage in deviant behavior. And this is, an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we have these stereotypes, and we tell someone that's part of a group that is stereotyped that they're expected to behave in a way, they are much, much more likely to actually behave that way. That's what the self-fulfilling prophecy is. And that's one of the big aspects of Howard Becker's labeling theory, is that when we label these deviants, one, we treat them as deviants as a society, we treat them lesser, we treat them as deviants, and two, they view themselves as deviants, so they are more likely to commit deviant acts in the future. So that accounts a little bit more for the individual and for the environment when we compare it to differential association. And structural strain theory is the third theory that we're going to talk about, and that's Robert Merton to the right. His structural strain theory explains deviance as a consequence of individuals not being able to fulfill their social goals. So if society does not provide the means of achieving a goal in a way that is in line with its norms, individuals will deviate to achieve these goals. So basically what it's saying is that most to all of deviant behavior is a result of necessity. Basically, they're saying it's a result of survival necessity. So remember, we have differential association, where we're basically saying we learn deviant behavior from people around us. We have labeling theory, which says society is responsible for the label, and then that label is how we view ourselves, and it's how we interact with society that has the biggest effect on deviant behavior. So structural strain theory is just basically saying when the structure of the society is not allowing us to fulfill our goals, specifically, like needs, like biological needs. So if we can't get food, if we can't get money, if we have no shelter, no water, structural strain theory is saying that those are the biggest factors that come into play when an individual performs deviant behavior. And that's what we mean when we say society does not provide the means of achieving a goal in a way that is in line with its norms. So basically, if we have someone that's financially disadvantaged and they're trying to put food on the table, but they cannot find a job, that's well paying, maybe they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to birth control, so they have a lot of children, they have no money. Structural strain theory, in the context of structural strain theory, this person, maybe these two parents in a two-parent household, are trying to achieve a goal, which is survival, financial goals. Even, for example, they're trying to feed their children and they're trying to keep a roof over their head, but the society is not giving them job, it's not giving them the money that will help them accomplish this goal. So what do? They resort to deviant behavior, theft, murder, anything like that. So for example, those in the US who are financially disadvantaged, just like the story I told, from birth have less access to social resources, including education, and will therefore more likely deviate. And that's why we see more deviant behavior in these lower income neighborhoods. So selling drugs or stealing, say. You have to, basically, Robert Merton is saying that we have to find a way to fulfill these goals. So if society is not providing us a way to fulfill these goals, we're going to fulfill them with deviant behavior. So one criticism of structural strain theory is that it does not account for non-utilitarian crimes, so malicious or violent in nature. So humans commit violent crimes all the time for non-utilitarian reasons. Crimes of passion, for example, murder is not always utilitarian. We don't always see humans commit murder, in order for them to survive. There are crimes of passion, there's revenge, we're emotional creatures. So structural strain theory doesn't really explain that kind of deviant behavior. It really only explains it in the context of necessity. So that's one of the huge criticisms of structural strain theory. And it's really important to keep in mind that when you're studying, sociological theories or any of these theories for the soft sciences, there's usually never one all-encompassing theory. There are just a couple of different theories, which it's super important to learn about because there are aspects of truth to each of them. They just don't all tell the whole story.